So I'd like to welcome you to Tadaima 2023, the first live session, a virtual community pilgrimage. This is our 4th year, so I'm really excited. This session is titled Megalomania and How We Can Counteract It, one conversation at a time. It also is retitled by Dr. Chandra, Treating America's #1 Addiction, Abusive Power. So we are so glad you can join us tonight. First, I'll do a little introduction of our speaker, and then we'll roll into the description of our session. But thank you again so much for joining us for this exciting first session. So Dr. Ravi Chandra, who's right here, is a good friend of ours and a wonderful ally. He's a psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator in San Francisco and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He writes for Psychology Today and East Wind Ezine, where his long-form essays are written from his corner of the intersection of Black and Asian lives. His debut documentary, The Bandage Placed, From AIDS to COVID and Racial Justice, won Best Film at the 2021 Cannes Independent Film Festival. Face Buddha, Transcendence in the Age of Social Networks is his full-length nonfiction debut and is the winner of a 2017 Nautilus Silver Book Award. And you can find more information at his website, which we will put in at the end of the session. So thank you again so much for joining us this evening. I will read you the new description of this wonderful session. Dr. Chandra, thank you so much for being with us. It's always such an honor to have you. And I feel like it's a continuation of our last conversation of speaking out and calling in with bravery and humility. So we appreciate you so much for continuing this conversation that helps us to better understand how we can operate in this current situation that we're in. So, penned by Dr. Chandra, I will read this to you now. Modern psychiatry recognizes that addictions result from frustrated, traumatic, and diverted belonging. Since the time of colonization to the founding of the American Republic to the current day, there's been a drive to declare dominance and subordinate others. Megalomania, the belief in one's superiority and the drive to control and manipulate others, lives on in conscious and unconscious forms. Dr. Chandra will map out megalomania and the addiction to abusive power and provide alternative examples of power in service to the greater good. Without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Ravi Chandra.
Thank you so much. Oh,
there's a hand
you got me?
up. Maureen?
Oh, there's.
Is there an issue, Maureen? Okay, she just turned her hand up. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay,
All right, there we go. All right. Thank you, Julie, Kimiko, and Tadaima for inviting me. 3 weeks ago, on September 11th, 2023, a white man broke into an Asian American family's home in Georgetown, Texas, and he beat a 6-year-old boy with a baseball bat. Little Jeremy showed signs of recovery, but was recently reintubated and is still in the ICU. And the recent update is that he has opened his eyes for the first time. I'm taking a moment to send him and his family our love for their healing. We all know what happened on September 11th, 2001, but what's less known is that Gandhi was thrown off a train in South Africa on September 11th, 1901. He refers to that event as not being thrown off a train, but being launched from it. And I'm happy to celebrate Gandhi's birthday and the International Day of Nonviolence today with this talk. Next Monday, a week from today, is Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm celebrating in advance by wearing my Chief Sialf t-shirt from the Duwamish tribe in Seattle, Washington, where I recently visited. We are meeting in a context of racism, violence, and colonialism that goes back hundreds of years, and we are here for a reason, to engage with that history and context and connect as a caring and compassionate community with the distress that we feel. 9/11 has been a distress call since at least September 11th, 1901, and we are launched every day that violence and suffering exists. Well, I'm in danger of having opinions today, and moreover, in danger of thinking everyone is entitled to my opinion. Well, I hope this talk will be good food for thought, and I'm sure everyone will have their own take on the material. I'm going to start sharply and then elaborate with a keynote presentation. My part will take up about 30 minutes in total. In the end, I'm just trying to find my notes in this great and dangerous jazz symphony called America. Well, and we'll start off with my saxophone solo, perhaps modeled in name after Deluge by the late, great Wayne Shorter, but really more like Giant Steps by John Coltrane. Da 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 da. All right, so here we go. I hope we'll have some fun and learn something here, but buckle in. America doesn't have a mental health crisis. America is a mental illness, by which I mean it is suffering and a cause of suffering. Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield has said, we're all at least a little mentally ill until we're enlightened. I think America's primary illness is addiction to power and wealth, which become an addiction to cruelty and avoidance and subordination of compassion, empathy, and shared humanity. The addiction is seen in the way its citizens feel frustration at the supposed others who are trying to take power away from them. We see what happens when someone gets between the power addict and their fix. For example, when those who are diverse and more comfortable with diversity start showing up. The power addict blames immigrants, migrants, BIPOC peoples, and sexual and gender minorities for daring to be seen and having intolerable voices and identities, for having human needs just like them. We see the effects of the addiction in the futility experienced on the regular by anyone trying to supply what's really needed: love, compassion, reason, justice, equity. We see the addiction to abusive power in the epidemic of gun violence and rising levels of gun ownership. When in doubt, when fearful, far too many Americans say, buy a gun. We see the addiction in the emotional burdens of women in a society geared for male domination and authority, and in the violence visited upon women by abusive men or men who can't control their own distresses. When you can't control your own distress, you seek to control others. And that happens regardless of gender. We see the addiction to abusive power in the structures of government and the electoral process, which skew parties towards extremism, career politicians, lifetime ossification, and loss of cognitive flexibility in the judicial and legislative branches, and performative, attention and money-seeking factionalism, particularly on the right. We see it in internet bullying and so-called cancel culture and online shaming. We see it in still rampant bias and exploitation of vulnerable groups, such as BIPOC people, sexual and gender minorities, the homeless, and the poor. We see it in the ways that people of certain dominant Christian traditions treat people of other faiths, and people of no faith at all, who are atheists, for example. We see it in the ways many Americans have to deal with abusive work environments. We see it in the way a special needs youth was recently nearly run over by hundreds of young men on motorcycles and ATVs on a so-called slow street in San Francisco. Impulsive display of brute power and a lack of empathy exists at all levels of American society and masculinity, because that's what gets attention and feels risky and exciting. Ask yourself how much compassion people with disabilities get in society or in the workplace. Mileage varies substantially, and lawsuits are often required to get fair treatment. We see the fallout from our addiction in the resentment, frustration, and anger experienced by all Americans because power and money can't buy you love. You see the fallout in 100,000 opioid overdose deaths a year. When people aren't cared about, they can turn to abusing themselves and others. Some seek a kind of power and control in an addiction. They might seek to numb the pain of powerlessness, vulnerability, and shame. On a more subtle level, you see our escape from discomfort, boredom, and loneliness into a kind of power and control with our smartphones and screens, which are a real mixed bag because our screens surface the need for belonging but do not resolve it. More dangerously, we see the addiction to abusive power in the misplaced and misinformed rage exhibited on January 6, 2021 at the Capitol. We see it in the increasing number of violent threats against election officials and judges and prosecutors involved in the cases against the former president. We see it in the racist violence in Jacksonville, Florida, Buffalo, New York, and elsewhere. All addictions are tied to and worsened by frustrated, traumatic, and diverted belonging. Someone once told me, "You're not American until you realize you've been screwed." Our ability to create and participate in belonging is what we are regularly screwed out of. But when the power addicted are anxious and insecure, when they feel they've been screwed, they don't seek belonging. They bind their anxiety by creating scapegoats. The power addict looks for someone to blame rather than admitting we are all fundamentally powerless as humans and we all need help. We all need to learn how to better comfort ourselves when we don't get what we want and we do get what we don't want. The power addict can't understand that we are interdependent or is deeply troubled by interdependence. The power addict can't face the fact that we are actually dependent on others, that we lean on others for safety and wellness. As Chief Sealth said, humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. The power addict thinks that when they act abusively, they act on others whom they consider or make bad, wrong, or inferior, or their opponent in an antagonistic game. This is the central delusion and gaslight in abusive power. White supremacy, a form of self-centered factionalism, is a gaslight and delusion, and it has driven this continent's colonization, the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of Blacks, and the exclusion and subjugation of Asians and Latinx peoples, even as egalitarianism and conscience contend to create a more perfect union and a more resilient democracy. And we are still fighting to be understood in our identities, which are currently being dismissed as a woke agenda and identity politics. We are still fighting in our quest for greater belonging, our quest to become Dr. King's beloved community. Is there a 12-step program for America's addiction to power? A PAA, Power Addicts Anonymous program? It's pretty wrenching because as far as I can see, America, as our patient, is unwilling to admit she has a problem and is unwilling to see those who are trying to help her as her allies. Maybe she's content to see everyone quite miserable, living with her addiction, addicted to seeing who exactly comes out on top, which for her means who gets the most attention. So then, what are we giving the most attention within ourselves, our minds and hearts? Power is a force within all our psyches, and we have to consciously cultivate what kind of power we will create as individuals, as a community, as a nation, and ultimately as sentient beings on planet Earth. I'll turn now to the keynote and discuss problematic and enduring power in greater detail. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. All right. Let me share and whoops. Okay, all right. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Oh, good, good. All right. So let me go ahead and start this. Oops. Oh, sorry. I gotta minimize the gallery here so I can see my slides. All right. There we go. All right. All right. And there we go. My mind's eye is covered in cotton. I am not myself, not fully with myself. Who am I? I am with a superiority complex and am lost in the fog of its self-importance, misanthropy, misunderstanding, and ignorance. So first of all, what is power? Sociologists define power as the ability to influence others. We all influence each other. Control is one's agency in attaining one's desired outcomes. Machiavelli said, "It is better to be feared than loved." Power, to Machiavelli, is ruthless, force, fraud, deception, manipulation, gaslighting, violence, threats of violence, antagonism, domination, being self-serving, incivility and disrespect to those below, quote unquote, below you, making them kiss the ring. This is how the megalomaniac demonstrates dominance. Another alternative through modern psychological research is by Dr. Keltner, who's a social psychologist at Berkeley. And he shows that power comes from empathy, that groups elevate the empathic. But here's the paradox. Those who attain power tend to lose empathy. And this has been verified experimentally in social sciences and neurobiology. The brains and behavior of those in power tend to change. They lose touch and become more self-centered and self-serving. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton from 150 years ago. And now I think power can come from empathy, but there are other ways that power can occur, that people attain power. And this is through talent, privilege, abuse, or extreme abuse, which we'll talk about, megalomania. And there's a sixth type of power that Keltner talks about, enduring power, that I'll talk about after I talk about megalomania. And I have a blog post at Psychology Today published last year entitled, "Which of six power types will you embody and support?" where I detail all of this. So we've got empathy, we've got talent, privilege, abuse, and extreme abuse. But the challenge is that society and the dominant culture raise some in power, but then how do we keep power in check? How do we ensure that values and virtues such as honesty and compassion predominate and rise in influence? So here's the influence continuum from Dr. Stephen Hassan, who is a cult and mind control expert. And on this, now there's good touch and bad touch. On the left side, you see constructive and healthy influence, which are democratic, mutual, related, compassionate, and interdependent forms of influence. In Confucianism, they talk about Zhen or Ren, bringing out the good in others, using one's agency to help others, be in service to others, alleviate their suffering. And on the right side, destructive and unhealthy influence, megalomaniac, narcissistic, factional, sociopathic, hierarchical, cult-like, a power complex, extreme, quote unquote, individualism, antagonism, competition, jealousy, hatred, greed, and other toxicity. Megalomania is the obsession with power, control, dominance, and self-importance. The megalomaniac is bent on dominating others to subordinate them to their will and to attain power, the ability to sway masses, and the accompanying wealth, status, agency, and control over outcomes. Analytically, it seems very infantile and insecure at the root, in that this person must feel the only way to be safe or to win is to have total domination. Safety to the megalomaniac might mean emotional survival, cultural preeminence, or winning real or metaphorical mates. Safety to the megalomaniac means having followers and sycophants idealize, idolize, and fear them. How do we code others? Social comparison is a human tendency, which likely varies by culture. Neoliberalism puts the individual ahead of collective and cultural forces, and thus amplifies individual and factional comparison and competition, as opposed to collaboration and relationship. And neoliberalism refers to market-oriented policies such as eliminating price controls, deregulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing state influence in the economy. But we can imagine that the megalomaniac codes self as superior and others as threat or enemy or inferior or as tools for one's wiles. And this determines their tendency to collaborate with, use or devalue or eliminate others. This is the essence of what's called the social dominance orientation. The labels of superiority and inferiority are placed on demographic groups to discriminate or elevate. A prime example, Columbus's view of indigenous peoples. They waded out to his boats bearing flowers and fruit when he arrived. He viewed them as inferior people whose kindness would make them good slaves. The grandiose claim to superiority might mask insecurity, inadequacy, shame, or even a fear of inferiority. And these would be associated with fears of being eliminated or considered a threat by others, or perhaps related to perceived or actual cultural experiences of being downtrodden. Now, I think the Europeans who came to this continent weren't treated so great where they came from. And they came, I think, determined never to be on the bottom again. In any case, antagonism often stirs antagonism and rivalry, and the megalomaniac meets some form of self-fulfilling prophecy of others becoming threats or enemies to them. Do they double down or do they relent and change and grow? On the other side of the spectrum, a person might tend to see others as equals on the level of common humanity and seek to improve mutuality, belonging, compassion, and the value of diversity. They might view individuals with nuance and complexity and seek collaboration rather than dominance. This is an egalitarian orientation based on relatedness and creating culture in the here and now. In our context, it's a commitment to loving, not being fearful and aggressive to those deemed quote unquote different, because we recognize our underlying interdependence, commonality, and unity. So relating through power means relating through domination, contempt, antagonism, fear, jealousy, blaming, shaming, criticism, and implying the other has the problem and that the one who has power is superior, is perfect, should be revered, and is in charge at all cost. Now here's a joke. I call this the Manhattan transference. Here's another jazz reference. Couldn't be hotter and couldn't be colder. So it's no ding on Manhattan. There are plenty of other cities and places where people can get full of themselves. Sometimes any one of us can have a little Manhattan project going on in our minds. And I want you to feel the danger of that idea of having a Manhattan project against others in our minds. Now, this is in contrast to relating through love, compassion, shared humanity, equality, support, warmth, unconditional positive regard. I call it the 4 A's of love: acceptance, affection, appreciation, and attention, and PUGs, presence, patience, understanding, guidance, safety, and support. So there's 2 ways of relating to others. We make each other special with our time and attention. And one way of viewing a megalomaniac is that they are exceedingly insecure and wish to monopolize everyone's time and attention, thus ensuring their specialness and thus their perceived safety through dominance or winning in a self-centered game. This both helps me have some compassion for them and also remain very wary. Relationships are not mutual, but transactional at best to the megalomaniac or narcissist. The megalomaniac might be addicted to maintaining the feeling of being the apple of their faction's eye, or what I call the front of the line feeling of always being at the top of the heap, that others are in service to them and never the other way around. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, in her book Strong Men, highlights despots from the era of fascism, Mussolini and Hitler, to the current era of illiberal authoritarian democracy. I think these psychological qualities are common to them all. The stages of megalomania. First, feelings of powerlessness and lack of prominence despite self-proclaimed superiority predominate. So there's resentment, grievance, envy, shame, frustration, fear of being overtaken or supplanted, and so forth. And these are not noticed so much as being acted on by becoming their identity and drive. Then they develop a determination to become powerful and dominate, get their rightful due, take their privilege and entitlement, and thus be rid of those uncomfortable feelings. They generate a manipulative empathy and charisma, tapping into others' powerlessness, vulnerability, and desire for dominance and belonging. And they scapegoat an enemy. And they use these and other tactics, such as deception, to attract followers, control information and perceptions, command loyalty, dominate, and attain preeminence. The photo on the left is from a Western apparel store and says, John Wayne. It looks like it's going to be another fine day. Fine for whom? The director, John Ford, famously said of John Wayne, that SOB looked like a man. Well, what kind of manhood has America idealized? America has idealized the individualist ethos since its founding. As a nation created by settlers expanding into a frontier, America advanced the archetype of the rugged individual, utterly self-reliant, depending only on his guns and wit to survive. This individual had to be ready to kill animal predators and was encouraged to kill Native Americans as well, to claim his territory and protect his kin. And of course, these so-called individuals were supported by malicious government policies. Walter Weil, who later co-founded the New Republic magazine, wrote in 1912, "The open continent intoxicated the American. It gave him an enlarged view of self. It dwarfed the common spirit. It made the American mind a little sovereignty of its own, acknowledging no allegiances and but few obligations. It created an individualism, self-confident, short-sighted, lawless, doomed in the end to defeat itself as the boundless opportunism that gave it birth at last became circumscribed." And I think you see that in what's happening in this country on the borders and in around the elections. For a more romantic view of this, here's Roy Rogers singing a Cole Porter tune from the 1930s. And you might want to lower your volume a bit as this clip tends to play a little loud. Okay, so I'll go ahead and play it.
Wildcat Willie, looking mighty pale, was standing by the sheriff's side. And when that sheriff said, "I'm sending you to jail," Wildcat raised his head and cried, "Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in, let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in, let me be by myself in the evening breeze and listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you please, don't fence
hope you're able to hear that, see that. Our liberty was said to derive from a man's ability to move freely across a frontier without limit. What does that mean for government? The Bill of Rights in the Constitution established the rights of the individual against a potentially menacing government. Meanwhile, the government cleared the way for individuals to advance across the frontier. Yet the federal government itself was designed with checks and balances to limit the power of any branch or individual. The framers of the Constitution struggled with the dangers of power, especially when invested in a single person. But true to our individualist ethos, over the last 50 years, the executive has gained enormous power. The president, above all, has been sanctioned to sing, "Don't Fence Me In." Whom to blame?
Alexander Hamilton!
All right. Well, Alexander Hamilton advocated for a lifetime presidential term, in effect, an American king. An American king could be a narcissistic sociopath if the balance of powers are eroded. David Brooks wrote in a review of Cherno's biography, "At Valley Forge, Hamilton saw how fundamentally weak the nation was, how lacking in the sort of productive capacity one needs to wage a war or survive as an independent nation. This was the formative insight that shaped his career. He favored more centralized power than most of the delegates and was far more suspicious of the masses. Hamilton's effort led to a centralized federal bank and hence the nation's capacity to wage war. You could draw a line from that amplification of executive, financial, and military power to America's victory in World War II, but also the wars and broken treaties with native nations, Executive Order 9066, and the subsequent wars driven primarily by the executive branch and not declared or authorized by Congress, from Korea and Vietnam to the Persian Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Many historians conclude Madison, Hamilton, and their fellow framers were building structural barriers against what they saw as the darker aspects of human nature, including what Lincoln called the exceeding brightness of military glory. Nixon famously advocated for an executive above the law by agreeing with counsel that if the president does it, then that means it is not illegal by definition. Ed Meese, counselor to President Reagan, and Dick Cheney, ranking Republican on the House Select Committee investigating Iran-Contra, advocated for essentially unlimited executive power. More recently, then Attorney General William Barr opined that the president cannot be charged with obstruction of justice because that threat of prosecution would throttle presidential power. Presidential authority regarding law enforcement, in Barr's view, is illimitable. Barr seems to have changed his view around the end of 2020 when Trump started promoting the big lie, and Barr had a book to sell. All right. We've talked extensively about abusive, megalomaniac, and executive power. Dr. Keltner defined enduring power in his book, The Power Paradox, which I mentioned earlier. Keltner, and I highly recommend this book, Keltner relays these insights for enduring power. And our journeys towards identity, belonging, wellness, and meaning are deeply connected and all depend on focusing on vulnerability with empathy and compassion, not with abusive power. So enduring power comes from a focus on others, from empathy, from sharing, from expressing gratitude, and from telling stories that unite. That's all from Dr. Keltner. I would add to these the qualities of humility and the practices of apology and reparation. Early in medical school, I actually practiced standing in front of a mirror and saying, "I don't know," while looking myself in the eyes. Admitting fallibility was so hard at that early, tender stage, but so necessary. And it's the only way to grow. I think apologizing is also essential to growth and creating belonging and wellness in a system where there have been so many failures of empathy and compassion and so many examples of abusive power. Since authoritarianism has been associated with ethnocentrism, I think it follows that diffusing authoritarianism in the dominant culture requires racial reparations. Now, this is from Kehinde Wiley's exhibition currently at the DeYoung Museum in Golden Gate Park. I think his works will be seen as significant as Picasso's Guernica, as commentary on contemporary suffering and vulnerability. Here I see the massive scale of humanity, both in strength and in prone vulnerability. We should stay vigilant about abuse of power, especially as rhetoric and action impact vulnerable individuals, communities, and outgroups. The megalomanic's journey is both nihilistic and solipsistic, but carries a delusion of survival, of triumph against man and life. It is an addiction to fame, notoriety, and centrality, which travels a well-greased sluice created by society, whose unseen workings are made visible by the rise of despotism and strongmen. I would suggest that American society is alarmingly megalomanic and addicted to power, wealth, and attention. And this has created a great chasm of care, belonging, and equity, and a crisis of conscience, which is now playing out in our body politic. The would-be despots in our midst make an invisible sociopathy visible. We buy into a blockchain of subtle oppression unless we actively resist. Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond points out in his new book, Poverty by America, that Americans do more to subsidize affluence than alleviate poverty. He points out that affluent Americans benefit from government policies and corporate practices that keep poor people poor. I would say the wealthy benefit from policies that keep poor people and BIPOC people poor and sick. People of color and those not in the dominant culture are disproportionately impacted. There is a subtle megalomanic force, a drive for dominance that we are openly grappling with. We can think about how this erodes mental health, safety, and belonging. What do we do as people of conscience in a world that consciously and unconsciously promotes cruelty? What do we do in a world that passively commits us to cruelty unless we actively commit to compassion? As we emerge from the pandemic, many of my patients in their early 20s expressed social anxiety. Essentially, will people be mean to me? Are others essentially aggressive or kind, truculent or benevolent? Some of them ask that about themselves as well. I explore these questions with them, and I explore them with myself. It is a question that can leave me feeling quite undone because we are never done. We are all works in progress. Our psyches are a constant co-creation, endeavor, and adventure. Being in a gathering of people concerned with this question of abusive power and compassion as an alternative is a gift and an inspiration. And with that, I am done, and I will come back. So thank you very much for listening. Oh, I see we kept most of our audience, so that's a good sign, I guess. All right. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Julie. All right.
Thank you, Ravi. I mean, wow, so many concepts, and it really helps to, like you were saying before, to name things, and to identify. So many things are going through my mind that are happening now that this helps to, identify and explain. So I have a lot of questions, but I want to go to our audience and see if anybody has some questions that they'd like to ask Ravi. You can, let's see, you can put your hand up because we'd love to have you just ask it directly through Zoom. That's a nice thing about Zoom, right? Is that we can, like in person, we can just talk to each other. So, Neil, did you have a question or no? I saw somebody go like that. Anybody have a question? Well, I have a question that maybe that will get us warmed up. So there's a lot to think about. So I'll just go back to thinking about, in my little circle or my little square of the universe. And, what are, so when we do identify and find that we're in a conversation with someone who's being megalomaniac, or this is a dynamic that's happening, whether that be at work or maybe on the street, what are some things that we can do? Um, Not a how to, but like, how do we best meet that person? I think one reaction is to like meet them where they're at and like shout back. um,
Right, right.
right? Or the other is to completely remove ourselves. I guess it really depends on the situation. But what are some things that
Right.
you suggest?
Well, I think there's no right perfect way. I think it's a learning experience for each of us is on our own journeys with the
Okay.
people in our lives and in society. And so I think the goal is to cultivate presence and compassion for oneself and retain compassion for others who are abusive. I mean, it's hard to be compassionate to an aggressive person. I mean, it's very hard. And I think, it's nice to at least retain a seed of shared humanity, like remembering that the person who's acting abusively is still a human being. You know, they've gotten diverted from connection and equality and all of that, but they're still a human being. But that being said, I mean, ultimately there have to be some consequences and barriers and boundaries and so forth. But I think remembering that, I think self-compassion. These folks make us feel badly, or they make us feel angry or upset. So we need that self-compassion, self-care, relatedness, building your allies, talking to friends, getting mental health support, etc. And then we have another, and then we might think later, oh, I wish I would have said that. I wish I would have done that. I mean, that kind of keeps building us. So until we're able to, at the moment, say what keeps us ourselves. And that's, there's a wide spectrum. I mean, you might not feel safe speaking back to a megalomaniac. So protect yourself, be safe, be well. But there may be a moment where you or groups of others can upstand instead of bystanding and intervene. And I think we have to promote overall nonviolent rhetoric and really limit the ways this is impacting us all right now with what's going on in politics. So I hope that we can collectively say that that's not acceptable. To make threats to people. The judge in Georgia getting death threats. If Trump's not elected next year, we're going to come and kill you. I mean, this is awful stuff that's being kind of unleashed by the leadership and the right.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I think sessions like this are so helpful, because they are building that community or building that support. Um,
Yeah.
do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, here we go. Okay, here we go. I like this, Neil. Is there a story of a skillful encounter that Dr. Chandra has had? Yes, I like that.
Well, I mentioned one in the talk last year with somebody who was kind of just really tied up with an abuse paradigm. So, I mean, that was one. So I don't want to repeat that one necessarily, but it was just like really, I had fire, so I spoke back directly to that person who I encountered before a movie, just a stranger who just said some very obnoxious and racist things about the left and BIPOC people and so forth. So I just couldn't tolerate it. So I spoke up in the moment. I think that other things, I think I'm kind of trying to engage with my psychiatric profession and the American Psychiatric Association as an organization to teach, to inform, to build resources for for patients and for my colleagues who are facing this. So I think it's all about allyship, and we have to create community. So I think, we with this, we are creating communities that care about distress, and that's the essence of communities. So we're sharing distress and learning how to care for distress. So I think building allyship and community.
Lisa, do you want to go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask your question? I think that's a great thing that you put in the chat there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have had megalomania, power dynamic relatives, and it's difficult. And one of the things that has worked is to focus on what we have in common, finding something we have in common. Like when I was discussing with a cousin some voter suppression stuff, and she had never thought about it through. But we started talking about, well, we both want to have everybody be able to vote, and we both thought about how when Grandma was cutting the pie and serving everybody wanted a piece of that pie, and that's a tiny example, but we would talk about the things we had in common, of recipes or how to take care of the kids or what some person was doing in the neighborhood. And by doing that, my right-wing cousin was unable to dehumanize me, and likewise vice versa. And when people would tell me, oh, those right-wing blah blah blah, and I say, well, I'm thinking of my cousin. She's a real human being. She's my buddy who we used to play cards on the farm. I was just wondering, what kind of experiences have you had with that angle of response and interaction? Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can work. Getting down to shared beliefs, but also, as I said earlier, is like that remembering the other person as a human being, and instead of reacting and in opposition to them, because that can set a back and forth, it's like maybe being curious, like, oh, how did you get there? Where are you getting your information? What's your angle on this? And how does this relate to you're so kind in other ways, but here it seems like things get really tense. So just being, I think, able to be curious and giving them safety too, because I think that it may be hard for them to let go of a position, but I think if you kind of recognize their thought process, perhaps it can be helpful. So curiosity, empathy. Yeah.
I was kind of thinking about, instead of going directly, like, I'm getting curious instead of furious, as I say, and asking why, instead going to the side and just going off into safer or different, more productive direction of humanizing. Right. And once there's the humanizing, and oh, we haven't, you like the Seattle Seahawks? Okay, I do too. Right. Oh, wow. No, I don't. Yes. But find something in common, then it's easier to kind of tuck back into the tough subjects. So it's like finding the common first makes it possible to get back to the other hard stuff.
I think so. I mean, it's been a long staple to not talk about politics and religion at the Thanksgiving table, right? I mean, that's pretty common. So having, whether it's sports or music or, something to humanize the encounter, I think that's important. And that, at least, I think I'm most worried about a far fringe getting violent. So I think the more ways we have to cultivate nonviolent relating between people, and just like, maybe people can say, oh, I'm really mad about that, but I'm not going to, harm anybody who believes differently. I think that's important to get to.
Yeah, when we talk to people who've left hate cults, it's often a moment of kindness from somebody else that humanized, that helped pull them out of those hate cults of white nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, oh, yeah, we care about you. We see you've changed. There's a great documentary called The Brainwashing of My Dad, which I would highly recommend. It's like how a kind person ends up becoming very rabidly holding rabid political opinions, etc. And then he kind of got deprogrammed when his family was fine. There was some way that his TV stopped working, basically, and that kind of brought him back to normal influences in his life. So having those supportive, positive, healthy influences can shift people.
Thank
Also ask, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
I was just saying, thank you. I appreciate your addressing.
yeah.
Okay, we got a couple more. Mary Abo, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, Ravi. I remember that you talked about having a cool head and warm heart. And I also remember that you talked about kindness. So, how do you show kindness when you're furious?
Well, I think, like I said, I think everybody's on their own journey, and I think, sometimes the Dalai Lama said in his book Healing Anger, sometimes you have to blow the conch shell. Sometimes you have to kind of let out the steam and say, say. And RuPaul said, I hope I can say this on our YouTube channel. RuPaul said, sometimes just got to tell a mother blanker off. Okay, so I'm not kind of idealizing calmness and peace as the only way. I think we have to respond as we feel, but I think returning to kindness helps too, and returning to and having a kind of a bedrock of stability. I mean, relationships are the highest form of spiritual practice. Um, as folk Buddhist wisdom saying, and so I think all relationships can have conflict and can get under our skins, but so that's what they expose vulnerability. So I think just recognizing, oh, what this person says or is doing makes me feel very vulnerable. How can I support my vulnerability when I'm dealing with this person? You know, what do I need to do within myself? Do I need to practice more self-care, more self-compassion? Do I need to develop a strategy? Do I need to have exit strategies when things get too hot? Because you recognize that the pattern just perpetuates the problem. It doesn't solve it. So so I think it requires all of those things. So, but I think self-kindness and ultimately kindness really is the ultimate instruction of being a human being, right? And existing in relationship to each other. But so I think, yeah, just expanding that foundation, but recognizing that we all sometimes have to tell somebody off. Sometimes, I mean, that's part of our uh, part of life. To but I mean, yeah, I mean, it sometimes throws us into conflict because an otherwise kind person, being having to be rude. I mean, it kind of creates this jumble inside. We have to have the self compassion to bring ourselves back, and like so you know
No, definitely. One other thing that's on my mind too is, so how do we collectively, um, I'm thinking now more of the upper levels when we see this in our representatives in our Congress, or we see this in our mainstream society. How do we collectively respond? I mean, we can become part of the King's beloved community. There are a lot of people out there, you know, making a difference. What are some things? I mean, Suited for Solidarity has been great for the Japanese American community. Um, I don't know. What are some
yeah,
things as a
that
collective?
we can do as well.
Yeah.
I think it's really intense, and I think we're I wish that I think first of all we just have to recognize that democracy is at stake, and our mental health and is at stake. Our so much is at stake, And I think we have to keep renewing ourselves to support democracy and support the candidates who support democracy. And I think it's not an answer of solving it, but we're in a struggle. I mean, this is going to take motivation, empathy, community building, and ultimately relating to each other on a much deeper level, creating that community that cares about distress. I think that's that we are doing that in this gathering, and as we talk about this, and I'm just remembering this incredible example of Buddhist monks who were tortured, Tibetan Buddhist monks who were tortured in in Tibet, imprisoned and tortured, and they said that when they escaped, released, they said to Dalai Lama, "Oh, we were he asked them something about what were you most afraid of, and they said we were afraid we would lose compassion for the people who were torturing us." I mean, that just I mean, there are some monumental human achievements of inner life and compassion. But that's what keeps us human, is by retaining compassion, retaining shared humanity. Um, and Brian Stevenson, what brings us to our embodiment as humans is our proximity to suffering. So we're suffering when we're right up against abusive power, but remaining as close as we can to our suffering with compassion, I think brings us deeper into our humanity. And I think we'll find answers as we do that.
Wow, thank you so much. We're going to have to definitely have a follow-up email that will go out to all of you with all of these resources that Dr. Chandra has mentioned. I think there's just a wealth of information here. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We're coming up on the hour. Unfortunately, it comes so fast. Oh, we have another. Let's see. Okay. Oh, yeah. And Kimiko, thank you. She's putting some of those links in the chat if you want to grab some of those, but we will also send those out.
I have one. Oops. Oh, let me put one in too. Let's see. There we go. I'll find it. There we go. Oops. Oh, can you hear me still?
Yes. Okay. Oh,
Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. I just put my link tree I put
oh,
there
great.
so that can, yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, it's so wonderful to spend this time with you all. And thank you, Dr. Chandra. Always a pleasure. I always learn something new. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Wow.
And I hope that you'll all continue to join us for Tadaima as we continue week 1 in our community pilgrimage. If you go to the website, you'll see the week 1 schedule there. And we can drop that in the chat when we send that to you. We will also put in, Dr. Chandra has a link, the link to the first opening story that he opened with, the young boy who's suffering. They are doing a fundraiser for him. So if we will also put that in the chat as well. There it is. Okay, great. Thanks, Kimiko. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again. Stay tuned. And again, we will send out these resources and the links. Any final last word, Ravi, to you?
Oh no, just thank you for showing up, and thank you to Daima again. And I hope this is good food for thought.